Well, good morning, everyone. Great to see you and to share this time with you. I want to say hello to all the folks who are gathered over at our southeast site today as well. I was just thinking this week, it's been a while since I've seen everybody over at the southeast site, so I hope you all are doing well over there and glad to have this opportunity to connect with you. Well, over these last couple of years, as we have been journeying together through this pandemic period, there is so much about our lives that has been changed in a variety of different ways. One of those is that we have been invited into one another's homes in a strange and new way that we'd never experienced before, through the window into one another's lives that Zoom provides. And of course, so when we spend time on Zoom, which I imagine that probably all of us here have at some point in the last couple of years, we're careful to tidy up a little bit, try to position the camera in the way that sheds the best possible light on our home, maybe scoot that laundry just out of view. But invariably, when we're part of a Zoom gathering, it's not unusual for a dog in the background to start barking really loudly, or for a small child to come running through the view, or for someone to appear at the refrigerator in their pajamas. There's actually people now that are specialists in rating the backgrounds of people who are being interviewed on Zoom, on TV, to say how good a job they've done at staging their living rooms. Because this has become such a big part of our lives, this window into one another's homes. I was participating just a couple weeks ago in a class, a 5-day-long class on Zoom, and at one point during a 15-minute break, one of our classmates inadvertently left his microphone on for the entire 15-minute break. And several of us in the class were trying to send him messages to let him know, hey, your microphone is on. And I think you could kind of feel the uneasiness in the whole rest of the group, because he and his wife were carrying on this animated conversation the whole time. And I think we were all bracing ourselves that something embarrassing might happen. Which it didn't, fortunately, and also the entire conversation was in Portuguese, so none of us could actually tell what was really going on. But in today's passage, we are invited into a similar kind of situation. We encounter this interaction between Mary and Martha in their home as they host Jesus there. And just to stimulate our imagination a little bit, I thought we would share this image that was painted by Johannes Vermeer, who was the 17th century Dutch painter, and he tries to give expression to this moment as Martha has opened her home to Jesus, to his disciples. She's clearly welcomed Jesus into her space, and she's made room for him there. Some students of this passage have suggested that these two women that we encounter in this passage, Mary and Martha, were likely among the group of women who just a couple chapters earlier in Luke Chapter 8, verses 1-3, we're told we're traveling with Jesus and we're actually helping to fund his ministry. And so here we don't have the benefit of looking through the Zoom view, but we catch some glimpses nonetheless of what goes on in this home, in the interaction between these two siblings. And as we look at these few verses, we see that they clearly had different priorities, different personalities that they brought to the mix, perhaps, but different priorities, definitely. So let's just take a moment and consider together the priorities that we see playing out in Mary and Martha as we look at these verses together. First, we see in Mary, in verse 39, we're told that Mary is pictured here sitting at the Lord's feet, listening to what he said. Sitting at his feet. Now, this term had special significance in that time. A student would have actually used this phrase to attach themselves to a rabbi. It expressed that they were connecting themselves with a teacher of the law and devoting themselves to that teacher. It reflected in their mind and in their life that the student was embracing the view and the practices of the teacher. And the Apostle Paul, actually, who is one of the great teachers of the early church, uses this term in Acts 22, verse 3, to describe his own background of being trained at the feet of the well-known Rabbi Gamaliel, who is one of the legendary teachers of that day. But what we see happening here is we see Mary sitting at the feet of Jesus. Something pretty radical and actually potentially scandalous is playing out, because in that time, this place of sitting at the feet of a teacher was reserved only for the brightest of boys who showed the most potential as students. And it was definitely not a place for a girl, for a woman to be found. In fact, we know that most rabbis of that time would have rejected Mary as a pupil. Too scandalous, too out of the box. And this would have been true even if the meeting was taking place in her own home. That just simply would not have been a place where she would have been welcome. But here, in these verses, we find her sitting at the feet of Jesus, and we see that he has a place for her there. He welcomes her there at his feet. And we find her listening to what he said. That's pretty crucial. So let's hold on to that. We'll come back to it. But let's look also at Martha's priority as we see it described here in this passage. We're told that she was distracted by all the preparations that had to be made. So Martha, we find, not sitting at Jesus' feet like her sister, but working away in the kitchen. We might ask ourselves, well, why? Maybe we feel, particularly if you sense that you are wired in a way that makes you identify with Martha, you might feel a little bit like, well, hold on a second here now. This story is being told in a particular way that makes us feel a little bit like maybe Martha is being set up a little bit by the way that she's being characterized here. And so I think it's helpful for us to try to appreciate Martha's priorities in this situation from at least two perspectives. First, in terms of what their culture of that day would have actually expected of her. In that time, as a hostess, welcoming guests into her home, she was honor-bound to provide her guests with some sort of meal. And lacking the convenience of being able to swing by Safeway and pick up a rotisserie chicken or run down the street to Pizza 73 or even just to dial in a delivery from Skip the Dishes, we see her scrambling to meet this expectation. And the impression comes through in this passage almost as though this was some kind of spontaneous gathering where she didn't have a whole lot of forewarning. And so now she, not having necessarily been given notice, is trying to pull everything together to fulfill a certain expectation. And failing to meet that obligation would have brought shame on her and on her family in the view of the community around them. But second, not only what her culture would have expected, but also we can see that there's something in Martha's actions that show a devotion to Jesus. Elsewhere in the Gospel of John chapter 12, in the account of the raising of Lazarus, we're told that this was a respected family within their community. And so belonging to a respected family in this community, Martha was actually risking her reputation a bit by associating herself with this controversial teacher, Jesus. Not everybody was into Jesus. Not everybody saw Jesus in a favorable light, but nonetheless, she was willing to risk her standing within the community by welcoming him into her home, knowing full well that the way things worked in that time, that folks didn't have much better to do than to gossip about what was going on around town, and that word would have spread. And she counted the cost of that. But we also see her counting the literal cost, because the expense involved in hosting people in her home and providing them with a meal was no small thing. And scholars tell us that she may very well have been a widow who would have been living with a fixed income of some sort. And so we can see that, in a sense, Martha was operating out of a desire to please Jesus and to please those who were in his company. It's what a good Jewish person of that time would have done. It's what she knew. And so she was operating from the assumption that surely this is what it would have taken to please Jesus in an instance like this. And as we look at Martha's behavior in this passage, it's clearly not the case that she didn't have a full appreciation of who Jesus was. We actually see her referring to him as Lord in this passage. So she acknowledges him as Lord. And furthermore, she seems to actually know him fairly well. If we look to verse 40, we see that she is secure enough in her relationship with him to kind of poke at him a bit, to goad him. She says, Jesus, don't you care that my sister's leaving me to do all the work? Tell her to help me. That's not something that you would say to someone who you don't feel a certain level of security and comfort with. We see her expressing frustration over the fact that while she is slaving away in the kitchen, that Mary is sitting and listening to Jesus. So she's concerned that her own sacrifice isn't being recognized in this situation. Hey, take notice of how hard I'm working here. Or is she perhaps concerned with her sister's conduct? Doesn't she realize that for a woman sitting at the feet of a rabbi isn't proper? Jesus, please just send her back to the kitchen where she belongs and diffuse this awkward situation for all of us. Well, who knows? But it seems that she is overwhelmed and a bit irritated in this situation that she has been left to do all the work. And we can hear her kind of saying in her own mind, can't I just get a little bit of help? And Jesus then speaks into this moment of conflicting priorities. And how does he respond? He says, Martha, Martha, you are worried and upset about many things. And then he says, but few things are needed, or indeed only one. And you can almost hear the compassion, the gentleness in Jesus' voice as he offers her this word of gentle correction. In essence, he's trying in this moment to kind of break through to her, to reach out and remind her what from his perspective carries true value. He says to her, Martha, you're worried and you're upset. He was trying to help her appreciate in this moment that her attention was being pulled away from the moment, from Jesus' presence by, as he says, many things, the burden of all of her duties. And then he says, but only one thing is needed. Now, some students of this passage suggest that in making this contrast between all of the many things that she was preoccupied with and this one thing, that Jesus is actually drawing a word picture where he is taking what's happening in the moment and trying to harness it as a teaching moment. It's actually a food analogy between the many things and the one, because Jesus says, Mary has chosen what is better, and it will not be taken away from her. But what he actually says in the original language is that Mary has chosen the good portion. It's a term that is used to describe like a really good piece of meat, the good portion. It's as though Jesus is saying, now listen, you could lay out an entire banquet for us here we could work our way down the buffet and take one of everything. And it would never be as good as the one portion, the one thing that Mary has chosen for herself in this time, which is my word, my instruction, hearing from me, knowing me, responding to me. It's as though Jesus is saying, we could occupy ourselves with all of those things and eat to our fill and never truly be filled, never truly be fulfilled. But the one thing that Mary has chosen in this situation is what brings true fullness, true lasting fullness. It will not be taken away from her. This is where you find true fulfillment. Jesus isn't discounting or dismissing or devaluing Martha's service in this moment, but rather he is trying to gently, lovingly confront her assumption that he would be pleased by lots of doing. He's basically trying to confront and deconstruct her assumption that he would be pleased by lots of stuff that she's doing, the way that her culture had shaped her. And Jesus is trying to break through and help her appreciate that he's less concerned about her actions and more about what's going on inside of her, what's driving her. And it's as though we hear Jesus trying to say to her, regardless of what you've heard, regardless of what's going on inside of you or what your culture has told you, that from my vantage point, only one thing is needed. My desire is that you would prioritize listening to me, learning from me, knowing me, following me. Now, as we fast forward from this Zoom view into the world of Mary and Martha to our world today, we can pause to entertain the question of so what about us today? How might these words from Jesus reach out across time and speak to us where we are today? With my background as a professor, this last year I was invited to do a little work, very part-time, for theological college in Melbourne, Australia, at a distance. So far, there haven't been any free trips to Australia involved, but I'm holding out hope. As I work with students who are training for ministry in Australia, I am kind of helping to guide them through a series of courses focused on spiritual formation, how we develop our life in Christ. And as I've been getting acquainted with Australian culture, I was reading this article from an Australian publication that kind of caught my attention. And I think it speaks to the things that we're considering here today. This article says, "How are you going? All right?" Used to be the standard Australian greeting, but we've now adopted a more sinister form of greeting that sounds like a symptom of a society in the throes of madness. "How are you going?" "Busy?" is the new greeting, and to my shame, I actually used it recently when I ran into a friend at a concert. Busyness has become the new badge of honor. If you're not busy, you must be dead or on the scrap heap. If you're not busy, you must have fallen victim to the demon drink or gone to the dogs. Not busy? Good grief, what a loser. "How are you going?" "Busy?" is like a relentless spur we use to urge each other on, creating a personal version of the old Cold War promise of mutually assured destruction. If we all stay busy, if we cling to each other in this desperate, dizzy dance, none of us will notice what's actually happening to us, and we'll all be dead before we realize it. So why all this frenetic busyness, or at least the need to maintain the appearance of it? When did we decide that having a full plate was a virtue? That's a bit of a gut punch, and I think it speaks to much of the experience that folks have here in North America as well. And as we come back to Mary and Martha and we try to connect the dots between their experience and our own, we must be careful because it's easy to misunderstand the point of what's happening in this passage. We might read it as though Jesus is honoring the more studious or the more reflective or the more contemplative types among us, those who by nature find it a little bit easier just to sit there. And that he might kind of be dissing the doers or the activists. And probably many of us identify more with one or the other. Maybe some of us feel like we're wired a little bit more like Martha or like Mary. And I know because I have these conversations from time to time with people in the church that this is a controversial passage. That some of us get a little worked up by what we see happening here in this passage. Perhaps some of us feel a little bit more like one or the other at different times in our lives, or different times in the week, or different times in the day, perhaps even. Some of us, when we see what plays out in this passage, we might even feel a little bit judged. Like, hold on, Jesus, come on. Are you being altogether fair here? But I think that that can miss the point, because it's important that we have a chance to grasp what Jesus really means to speak to us here in these verses, I think. It's less about whether we are active people who do stuff. But Jesus' concern seems to be more with the underlying reasons of why we do stuff. the underlying motives that drive us in our lives. So we hear that question coming through Jesus about the things that cause us to be worried and upset and result in us being preoccupied. And to consider, how do these things play a role in distracting us from the presence of Jesus, in drawing us away from the presence of Jesus in our lives? Richard Foster, who is one of the great authors writing about the spiritual life in the last few decades, has this to say. He says, "We're trapped in a maze of competing attachments. One moment we make decisions on the basis of sound reason, and the next out of fear of what others will think of us. It's so easy to lose focus in the pursuit of legitimate, even good things. Job, position, status, family, friends, security, these and many more can all too quickly become the center of attention. So, he says, we need to articulate new, more human ways to live. We should take exception to the modern psychosis that defines people by how much they can produce or what they can earn. We should experiment with bold new alternatives to the present death-giving system." I think we can recognize in our own lives that we have our times when we find ourselves worried and upset about many things, and we feel the tug of that preoccupation. And as somebody who stands before you today engaged in full-time ministry work, I have to say that I find it interesting that the word that is translated as preparation here in this passage is actually in the original language related to the words service and ministry. And that kind of close cousin relationship reminds me that even the stuff that we tell ourselves that we are doing for Jesus can actually get in the way of our life in Jesus, of our sitting at his feet, listening to him, learning from him, knowing him, responding to his voice. Some of us perhaps may even be struggling with the notion that maybe I don't really belong at Jesus' feet. Maybe I'm not really worthy to be one who is at the feet of Jesus. And so we busy ourselves trying to get his attention or to win his approval by being productive. And so even our notions about what it means to do Jesus-y kingdom things can be held hostage by our cultural notions about what it means to be productive in this life. But I think Jesus would have us to appreciate from these verses that he isn't actually interested in us engaging in a flurry of activity in our lives in an effort to prove ourselves to him or to secure our place before him. And he tells us as much. Those really familiar words from Matthew 11 that we would do well to hear in a fresh way today. Jesus says to us, "Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light." There are so many good words in there. For those who perhaps come to hear Jesus feeling weary and burdened, he says, "I have for you rest. I have for you gentleness and humility in heart. Rest for your souls. A yoke that is easy, a burden that is light." Over the years, I've made occasional references to this book, Emotionally Healthy Spirituality by Peter Scazzero. And Peter Scazzero, the author of this book, which I imagine some of you have read, he writes out of his own experience of having to come to terms with a breaking point in his ministry as a pastor of a church on Long Island in New York, where things finally kind of reached a point where he was operating out of such unhealth and such kind of broken drivenness in his life, where his wife said to him one day as they were getting ready in the bedroom, "Hey, listen, it's not that I am leaving you, it's just that I don't want you to be my pastor anymore." And that was a breakthrough moment for him that began to set him on a path of change, of seeing things differently and doing things differently. We as a staff have been reading through this book together and engaging in discussion of it and reflecting upon its significance for our lives. And it's been such good discussion for us as a ministry team here at Central to recognize in our own lives all of the ways that we must be on guard against our own inclinations to busy ourselves, to feel the need to prove ourselves. And it's reminded us that Jesus' desire for us is to see our lives of activity and service, whatever we might be engaged in, being an outflow of our knowing him and our following him, rather than a substitute for that, or a way for us to try to prove that we're worthy of that. Jesus says to Martha, and he says to us today, one thing is needed. One thing is needed. Only one thing is needed. And we might respond to that by saying, one thing? Really, Jesus? Yeah, right. It can't really be that simple. But Jesus says this one thing is the one thing that will order all the other things. This is the one thing that will put all the other things in their proper place in our lives. Jesus invites us to listen to him, to prioritize his voice, his instruction in our lives. In a key passage that we'll look at more deeply in a few weeks in Matthew chapter 6, verses 33 and 34, right on the heels of kind of an extended part of the Sermon on the Mount where Jesus is speaking to the place of worry in our lives and our being preoccupied with worry. He invites us with these words. He says, "But seek first his kingdom and his righteousness, and all these things will be given to you as well. Therefore, do not worry about tomorrow, for tomorrow will worry about itself. Each day has enough trouble of its own." So as Martha, Jesus speaks in a gentle voice to us today, and he says, "Come to me, you who are weary and burdened. Rest in me. Come to me. Seek first my kingdom and my righteousness, and all of the other things will be properly ordered in your life. Come to me, focus on the one thing, and the one thing that will not be taken away from you, and you will experience a true fullness, all that you hunger for." We can recognize the kind of the self-determined people that we are, that truly accepting this invitation and truly relinquishing control over all the things that preoccupy us, or the illusion of control, if we're being honest, can be really hard. But Jesus says, this is the way that I intend for you. This is the way to freedom. This is the way to rest. This is the way to peace. Jesus isn't scolding us. He's not coming down hard on anybody. But he's actually inviting us to experience life in a fulfilling way as he means it for us. Now, as we go back to that painting from Johannes Vermeer, we see that we come to the end of this scene, and as the curtain prepares to close, we're not told, actually, how Martha responds. It's as though the scene comes to an end, and as the curtain closes, we see her standing there with serving tray in hand, and we're left with this question of, how will she respond? And perhaps that's appropriate, because it actually forces us to consider another more immediate question that faces us, which is the question of how will I respond to Jesus' invitation in this moment? What does it mean for me in the stuff of my own life to focus on the one thing, as Jesus says, that is truly needed? Now, it's intriguing that if we go back to John chapter 12, that passage that I referenced earlier, after Lazarus is raised from the dead, Mary and Martha, who are his sisters, choose to host Jesus in their home once again to honor him. And so we're told this: 6 days before the Passover, Jesus came to Bethany, where Lazarus lived, whom Jesus had raised from the dead. Here a dinner was given in Jesus' honor. Martha served, while Lazarus was among those reclining at the table with him. I just love that John threw that in there. Martha served. Here we are, 6 days removed from the end of Jesus' earthly ministry, and we find Martha still serving. I can't help but hope that she's serving from a different place. We'd see that Jesus hasn't fundamentally changed her as a person in terms of her personality. She's still a doer. She's still a lady who likes to get things done and to engage in activity. And the same may be true of us as well, that for those of us in this room who feel that we resonate with the wiring of Martha, that Jesus may not choose to change that about us, but rather he would have us to attend to the things under the surface of our lives that drive us. In recent years, there's a new verb that has been created. We can credit those millennials. The term adulting. This idea that during our 20s that we've got to figure out what this whole adult life stuff is about. So as I look back on my 20s, I just recall the struggle of adulting, of transitioning out of my teen years into my 20s and trying to figure out how do you pay bills and keep a home and be responsible at a job and things of that sort. And amidst the lessons of adulting, I think one of the things that I began to realize somewhere around the age of 28 was that, wow, time has really gone fast. And I remember at that point looking back on the better part of a decade that had passed by thinking, wow, any day now, I'm going to be in my 30s. And one of the things that I realized was that amidst all of the things that had preoccupied me as I was trying to embrace the agenda of adulting was as time passed quickly and more quickly and more quickly and more quickly, that it seemed like that just making a decision to say, well, I'll start to take that seriously tomorrow, that it kind of astounded me. It kind of shocked me a bit, I guess, how a series of I'll do that tomorrow decisions accumulated into weeks and months and even years. Like, I'll start to take working out seriously tomorrow. And next thing you know, a lot of time had passed. And I think I recognized that about my life with Jesus as much as any other area of my life. How quickly the time can pass and how easily I could miss the opportunity to sit at Jesus' feet and to make that one thing the main thing in my life. Now, we tomorrow will reach the end of January, and we have set this aside as a focused month of prayer here as a church. And maybe this has been a month where you really dug in and you felt like, I just gained a lot of benefit from this month. Good things happen because of how I chose to dig into the opportunity that this month has provided us. And if so, that's exciting. And maybe this has been a month where here it is, the 30th of January, and you're saying, oof, where did the time go? Maybe this has been a month where, despite all of your intent to the contrary, you've found yourself preoccupied with many things. And I just want to say to you today that it's never too late to begin. that we should never underestimate the value of small beginnings in our lives. To just simply say that today, let this be a day in which I choose the one thing that puts all the other things in their proper place. As we draw this time to a close, I want to just invite you to consider together with me a few on-ramps, some questions for us to take with us today. As you look at what motivates you under the surface of your life, what do you find there? Are there worries and preoccupations that you might need to surrender to the Lord? What might that look like for you today? And I do want to just say that if there's something really deep in your life in terms of a struggle with anxiety, and the last couple of years with all that the world has thrown at us, it's not been a time that's been especially kind to us as humanity where mental health is concerned. And so if you find yourself wrestling with a deeper, more profound struggle with anxiety, there's no judgment here, and we would never want to make light of that. It would encourage you that if that's something that you find yourself struggling with, to please reach out, and we'd like to help connect you to the resources that would be truly beneficial to you. But for those of us who perhaps are struggling more at the level of your everyday run-of-the-mill worries and preoccupations, what might it look like for us to surrender those things to the Lord? Secondly, are there adjustments that you might need to make to your current activity level to enable you to place greater focus on your relationship with Jesus? And then finally, what might Jesus' invitation to rest and seek first his kingdom mean for your life today? Please stand. Our team is going to come back and lead us. And as they do, let's just pray together. Jesus, thank you that you invite us to come and to rest. Thank you that because of your grace and your love for us, that you have a place at your feet for every one of us. That even when we don't feel worthy, that is a spot that you have reserved for us there. We pray, Lord, that you would help us to recognize the things under the surface of our life that are competing with truly choosing the best thing, to keep the main thing the main thing. We pray, Lord, that in your compassion and your gentleness, that you would show us what it looks like to seek first your kingdom and your righteousness, and for that to order our lives. Thank you that you never give up on us. Thank you that you mean for us freedom and peace, life. We bless your name. Amen.